The recognition of higher states of consciousness is a recurring theme that is evident in all cultures throughout history. What is the basis of our conscious experience, the cycle of waking, dreaming, and sleeping? The simplest state of awareness is a self-referral state. It is a field of all possibilities. As the physicist Eddington said, the stuff of the world is mind stuff. The ancient Yoga Vasishta likewise teaches that this world appears material, but is ultimately pure consciousness. These profound insights infer that consciousness is all there is, and we are not in the world. The world is within us. Welcome to Simplest State, where we examine these understandings and explore the very nature of consciousness and self-realization. George Barselaar was born in the south of Holland and grew up in Sydney, Australia, where he studied civil engineering and spent his spare time as a teenager either surfing or playing soccer. He continued his studies and went deeply into Vedic science and Sanskrit, and developed a keen interest in Kashmiri Shaiva philosophy. Feeling an irresistible pull, George went to India to study under the guidance of Swami Lakshmanjoo, who was the last living master of the oral tradition of Kashmir Shaivism. George was given permission to begin transcribing all of the Swami's recorded lectures, and he began working full-time to publish all of Lakshmanjoo's teachings as original transcripts along with the original audio recordings. George is connected with us today from Kashmir, India, at the ashram of Shivacharya Swami Lakshmanjoo Maharaj. Welcome, George, to Simplest State.
Thank you, Ron. Nice introduction, brief and to the point.
Most welcome. I'm delighted to have you here. I've looked forward to this conversation for a long time. Now, you were 18 years old when you were drawn to higher knowledge and learned meditation. And I'm wondering, was there a spiritual element in your upbringing or in your education that moved you in that direction?
I would definitely say yes. I was born into a very, very devotional Catholic family. And one of my earliest memories was sitting on the floor doing Mala Japa of the Rosary. We each had a set of rosary beads, and that was a daily occurrence where we would tell our beads, you could say. And it felt so familiar, even at that young age, just going through 10 Our Fathers, 10 Hail Marys. My mother was definitely a very special soul in my life, my father too. So there was that underlying spiritual background that I had from the age of 2 years old, as far as I could remember.
So that childhood upbringing in Catholicism, you felt enlivened some spiritual value in you. And did it encourage you and urge you to seek greater knowledge or spiritual knowledge, mystical knowledge?
No, I was a typical kid, did the family rosary until you were old enough to rebel and say you had something more important or homework. But my parents continued like that. We went to church every Sunday. I had mystical experiences in churches as a kid. I thought that it was part of the church when I would see these angels standing on either side. They were 8 feet, 9 feet tall. And I thought that they were actually always there. And when the bells would ring, they would just get elated. And that seemed normal to me. I thought everybody saw that, so it wasn't a big deal. But it was a special kind of feeling. But as I became a teenager, sort of stopped going to church and then had some experience which sort of changed me in a church, and I felt that some big event was going to happen. I didn't know what it was. At that time I was in music, smoking the obnoxious weed and doing everything that you did in the 60s. But then I met two hippies on a surfing trip to Byron Bay, very famous place in Australia. Many of you would have heard of it. I met two hippie sisters who had been lifelong vegetarians, and they were so unusual. They were so pure. There was something just mystical about them. And they were basically my first gurus. They said, George, you're lost. You got to find yourself. You have to go to a hippie commune. Take off everything, get rid of all material possessions and live there and see if you can feel something about your soul. Lucy, one of the sisters, gave me a copy of Cahill Gibran's The Prophet. So I went off. I was still working for the government. I was doing my civil engineering degree. I was 18. I'd started work at 16. I went off to a very famous commune in the northern part of Queensland, rainforest, perfect, 30 or 40 people, all naked, walking around, pretending they weren't looking at one another. And I was there for 2 weeks, but it didn't make sense because they were supposed to be free of material possessions, and yet they were all smoking dope. They were all attached to the one material possession that they weren't aware of. They could philosophize on everything, but none of them could give that up. I had given it up. By the time I got back to meet up with Lucy, they'd all learned TM. I learned TM. I walked out of the puja room in Sydney where there was a huge picture of Gurudev hanging on the wall. And I stood in front of that picture. I was very emotional. I said, I'm going to do this. I didn't know what that meant, but I'm going to do this to 100%, all the way. The next day, after first day checking, Martin took us all for dinner at a vegetarian restaurant. He produced his book of photos from his teacher training course, which was 1969, Rishikesh. And in that, Maharishi had taken the whole course to Kashmir. And there was a photograph of Maharishi standing with Swami Lakshmanjoo. It attracted me. I said, who is that? He said, oh, it's Swami Lakshmanjoo. He lives in Kashmir. He came to see us. He gave a lecture on Kashmir Shaivism. Maharishi was very, very close to him. And that's, I think maybe a seed might have been sown there. I don't know. My first residence course, I went the weekend after I'd been initiated. And the bliss was just infectious. So I dived deep into that straight away, and within 2 years, it was time for me to become a teacher. It was just very obvious that I needed to know that I needed to become intimate and develop an intimate relationship with Maharishi.
You had an awakening and a craving for more knowledge, for more of what you had experienced through the practice of TM.
Yeah.
In what ways had your life changed when you learned TM? If at all?
No, it just an immediate recognition that this was what you should do in this life. This is the most important thing, and an underlying blissful feeling, a recognition of something that used to happen when I was a kid. I wouldn't call it clear transcendence because I didn't know what that really meant, but as a child, I can clearly remember waking up in the morning, probably somewhere before the age of 10 years old, lying in bed and then being able to close my eyes and go back into this sky, this blue sky. And I could open my eyes again and realize I was awake, but close my eyes again, like right at the junction point. It seemed like I could sort of just flip back and forward between that and the junction point. And this felt very familiar.
Was that a blissful experience? Would you call it blissful?
Oh, yeah, it was blissful. It was blissful. But there was an internal kind of knowingness that came with learning TM that, and I didn't relate it to something that I'd done before, but I felt, my God, this is so familiar. This is so familiar to sit and meditate. And I was gung-ho, Ron. I had more people meditate, more of my friends. I think within 2 months, 45 of my social circle, all surfers and whatever, had learnt TM. Maharishi said it's better to be a vegetarian. We were all vegetarians overnight, no question. We were young. We were 18, 19, 20s.
And you were about 20, you were saying, when you decided to become a teacher.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And
Yeah.
what
That was.
motivated you? What was the greatest motivating factor?
I had a friend, Vince, childhood friend, who had done teacher training in Lantia. And I decided when he went to do teacher training, he had the money, I had no money, I was working a government job. So I left my government job, and much to my parents' dismay, I told them I'm going to become a TM teacher, which was shock horror for them. And I got a job contracting with engineers where I was making a tremendous amount of money. And when Vince came back, he was a bit shy to start teaching. And I said, no, I got plenty of money. Let's rent a center. Let's go and buy 20 chairs. And I did all that with my expense. I was so excited about just about the possibility of sharing this with people. That was my underlying motivation, to just share this with as many people as possible.
Was that in
And
Sydney?
that was in Sydney. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Now, you'd mentioned that, understandably, parents might have been somewhat taken aback when you decide to pursue becoming a teacher of meditation, because they, of course, are thinking of your well-being and your ability to earn a livelihood. And I'm wondering, up until that point, were they involved with your practice of meditation? Were they supportive of it up until then?
Not at first. My father really rebuked. He thought that it was something really foreign. My mother, being the soul that she was, she said to him, well, let's try it. Let's see what he's doing. Look, he's cut his hair. I had very long hair. He's cut his hair. He's cleaned up his act. He's obviously not smoking marijuana anymore. And but my mum started, and my dad he still had reservations. So he ran off to see the local priest, as you would. And he said to the priest, he said, my family, even my wife, and my 3 sons, along with George, are all doing this transcendental meditation. And I'm really worried. And the priest said, you said transcendental meditation? He said, yeah, that's what they're doing. My dad would say, the Maharishi or something like that. And the priest said, well, Tony, I have to tell you the truth. I've been doing that for 2 years because I had hypertension, and it really works. And I would advise you to do it straight away.
Ah, that's perfect.
So that was perfect. That was getting it directly from one of God's messengers. So he learnt TM the next week. And my dad had actually been a prisoner of war for 3 years up until the end of the war. He was a prisoner of war just outside of Hiroshima, far enough away not to be fully affected. So he had a lot of health issues. And within 6 months of doing TM, they all cleared up.
Wow.
So now my whole family it was group meditation whenever we were together and dinner together. It was something quite divine. And that went on for a few years until we all split up and went our own ways. But my mother and father never missed a beat.
Fantastic.
My mother and father meditated from 1972 or 73 up until the time they left this world.
Inspired by the changes they saw in you, at least in your mother's case.
Yes, at least in my mother's case. But my mother was very kind of hidden, and it was very natural for her. I remember I went to look after my mother for 4 years before she died. And she used to have a prayer group. These old ladies, all salt of the earth ladies, all had 6, 7, 8. One lady had 10 children. So they were Catholics. They went forth and multiplied in great numbers. So one day she announced to them after they'd done their little rosary thing, and she said, now George is going to teach us all to meditate. And I said, well, Mum, it's not quite like that. But I taught them just some very simple relaxation technique. And they meditated for 10 minutes. And at the end of it, my mother announces to them, she says, well, did you all see the blue light? And I looked at my mother. She said, yeah, the big blue light that comes in your forehead here and just sits there. And I said, Mum, this is the first time they've meditated. You've been meditating now for 40 years plus. She said, no, it'll come. If you do this every day, it'll come. And she'd never read a spiritual book, a yoga book. She did yoga. She did yoga from the early days, but, very, very divine lady.
And
yeah.
Now, you mentioned that when you were going to church as a young boy, you would see celestial beings. You would see angels in your church. Is that something that continued through your life outside of
No.
church as well?
That pretty much stopped when I stopped going to that particular church. This was actually a church which was also a primary school, a Catholic primary school. You know, the old system where they used to divide the rooms up. They had these big rolling doors, and they would open them all up. The school desks would flip down and turn into pews, and that's where I actually went to school first in Australia. And it had a divine atmosphere. That happened a few times, and then it went away. I never had celestial perception after that. That was just, I guess, a childhood thing that you accept. But I always remember when the bells ring, they had those little 6-bell kind of things. And bells, of course, in India enliven Shakti. Bells are usually rung when you're doing certain mantras for Mother Divine. And I felt the thrills go right through me and right through the place. You know, it was, yeah.
And then after teaching TM for many years and teaching thousands of people, you were drawn to Shaivism. Can you explain a little bit about what Shaivism actually is, and what's the distinction between Shaivism in a general sense and Kashmiri Shaivism?
I was fortunate to have a very close relationship with Maharishi, and I asked his permission. Could I go and study in India? Could I go and study Shaivism? And he gave me permission. Otherwise, I never would have done that on my own bat. And when I went and I met with Swami Lakshmanjoo, he actually, when he heard that I was a TM meditator and that I was a teacher, he was very adamant that I never miss my program, never miss my meditation program and everything that Maharishi had taught me. He said, you do that. And it wasn't until I'd been there a few months, I was attending the lectures, but I was very lucky because I immediately could go to his private lectures. And he was talking about practices within Kashmir Shaivism. So I asked him, I said, would it be valuable for me to learn some of these practices to become familiar? And he said, yes, of course. So the main difference, he taught me the very next day, basically. And it was a very simple technique it's a mixture of mantra and also awareness of the flow of the breath. In Kashmir Shaivism, it's a very important part of your practice because breath is prana, breath is life. And the breath itself, has a significant function. They've even got it down to that we breathe 21,600 times a day. And if we don't, we die. So the first thing we do in this world is we come into this world, we breathe. The last thing is we take our last breath. So the main difference was that there was just a subtle shift in awareness along with, these bija mantras where you watch your breath. And I remember asking Swamiji at the end of when he taught me, how long should I practice this? And he said, 20 minutes, 1 hour later. He said, until you're enlightened. So it wasn't that you did this practice only in a formal seated position. When you got up from meditation, it was such a simple practice. You could actually try to incorporate it into your day. And it wasn't something that divided your attention because I said once, won't that divide my attention? He said, you breathe, don't you? So that's the main thing that I would say that there was a difference.
Just wondering if you were to define what Shaivism is in a few sentences, how would you define it?
I would say that the underlying principle of Shaivism, which is a monistic system. So monistic means it's a system that sees oneness, that God and the individual are one. And from Swamiji's own statements, he said that the essence of this teaching is that God and the individual are one and the same being. To realize this is the essence of Kashmir Shaivism. So that I guess the real thing is that you realize that if there is only one being, if there's a supreme God or supreme Godhead, whatever you want to call Brahman, Shiva, Rudra, and that one being has manifested in all other beings. So every being from a bug up to the deities of Brahma, Vishnu, and Rudra, they are all manifestations that have come out of the light of God consciousness. And because you're also a part of that light, then you can realize your oneness with God through letting go of all of the illusions that have made us feel that we're separate.
Could we say it's much like the teaching of Vedanta, that consciousness is primary and that everything emerges thus from consciousness?
Yeah, those two things run parallel, but there are very subtle differences between Vedanta and Kashmir Shaivism, Advaita, Shankara's Advaita Vedanta. And possibly the main one is the idea of in Shankara's teaching, it's a very big part that neti, not this, not this. That the objective world is an illusion and doesn't really exist. In Shaivism, it says, no, actually Lord Shiva has, through his Shakti, through his energy, through the Divine Mother, has manifested everything in the universe. And therefore, it's real. The illusion is to see it in differentiatedness, is to see it as all different parts and not see the underlying field of consciousness that is vibrating behind everything. There isn't an idea of negation or an idea of renunciation in Kashmir Shaivism.
Although I have heard Vedanta described in those very terms as well.
Yes.
Not to say that everything is not real, it's real, but it exists within and from consciousness, that consciousness is primary.
Yeah, those two concepts run parallel and in total agreement with one another. I think the only difference that I would say is that the idea of Vedanta in general is considered to be, and has been for many years, a renunciation type of thing. I mean, sannyasins in India and all of these people who give up the world are considered to be really searching for some greater spiritual experience.
Certainly.
And in Kashmir Shaivism, it looks at the idea, if there is a oneness of consciousness in everything, then what is there to give up? Maybe it's just a shift in perception. And that happens in both the systems, but Kashmir never had a strong Shankaracharya tradition, never had a strong Vedantic tradition here.
Right. Although that could be put in the category of interpretation and implementation as opposed to the actual purity of the knowledge itself. In other words, both are monistic. How one realizes that may be different. And naturally, each discipline and each philosophy has its own approach to that knowledge. Would that be correct?
Yes, yeah, definitely. In a previous conversation, we were talking and we touched on that wonderful statement of, I think it's Thich Nhat Hanh, who kind of summed up the idea of Kashmir Shaivism, at least, and Vedanta, in that we feel, anyone on a spiritual path, anybody who starts meditating, we feel that we're sort of conscious beings trying to have an experience of consciousness. And for a monistic system, it's the other way around. You have to realize that actually we are consciousness having the experience of an individual being. Right.
It's a question of perspective. Which one is primary? Which one underlies the other one? And that's the growth to enlightenment is very much a shift of perspective.
Yeah.
Now, in the podcast description for this program and in the introduction, we talk about how the fact that Sir Arthur Eddington said, the stuff of the world is mind stuff. Another way of saying consciousness. And I'm wondering, in your experience and in your understanding, how would you interpret that? What does it mean to you when you read something that physicists say that point very much in the same direction as what you've studied from a spiritual perspective.
Yeah, well, I mean, look at it, the subject we've just touched on, which is this idea of consciousness being the underlying principle of everything. So if there is one being, then they have manifested this whole universe. And they've manifested it through the expression of consciousness coming into the world, this energy of consciousness. As a limited being, we have manifested our own universe through the mind. The mind is the container for each and every one of us. The mind is the container of our own reality, our own limited universe, we can say. And that universe, the size of that universe, depends upon the capacity of our mind to expand and incorporate and understand how big we actually are.
Such a beautiful point, too, because all of us, we tend to think of the world as external. Here we are within our skin, and everything else is an object that is outside of ourselves. And we forget or fail to realize that that entire experience of that world, the objects in this room, the objects that I think about beyond this room, beyond this world, they're all experienced via my own consciousness. Whatever perception, whatever thought we may have exists within ourselves.
Yes, yes. Yeah, the light of consciousness. The Sanskrit word for that is prakash. The light of consciousness is shining through the eyes of every living being, whether it's a bug or whether it's a celestial deity. That light of consciousness is shining through every perception. The mind is this cloak which either differentiates everything that we're seeing, and we forget that actually the very thing we're looking for, which is consciousness, is actually the torch we're holding in our hand. It's the light coming from us. And we continually get, it's called lost in the world or lost in thought. And Kashmir Shaivism has a beautiful thing about the mind, that you don't have to refute your mind, because the mind, the limited mind, is just consciousness turned inward on itself. And it creates a bubble of our own small reality. And when the mind dissipates, the exterior of that bubble, which is our own small little world, disappears, and consciousness then again embraces itself as a universal ocean. And this is the whole concept of moving from limitation of our own little universe, in which we have freedom to move about, but freedom based on what we know, to moving to a more universal state where you have the freedom of perfect knowledge, of universal knowledge.
That's so well expressed. Thank you, George. I really like that. It reminds me, too, of descriptions I've heard where it has been said that the ignorance is due largely to inadvertence, that we fail to put our attention on the self, on that pure value of consciousness, and instead become engrossed and engaged in the small self, the activity of the mind and our senses of perception, whereas the reality is there all the time. But due to inadvertence, we fail to notice it. Yeah, beautiful. Because, let's hypothetically say that we are God. Because we don't feel it. I feel limited. I know I'm sitting in a room here, but let's say that everything that I've studied for the last 50 years or more, let's say that I am actually God, or I'm Brahma, or I'm Shiva, and everything else is that. So what is the first experience for a limited soul when they actually have the direct experience of that? And Swami Lakshmanjoo says that the first experience that comes is a feeling
a recognition that I always was this. And they look back on everything else as, what was that? That was play. Kashmir Shaivism looks at it as play. If God wants to play in the world, without us, without our eyes, and without the eyes of all living beings, there would be no universe.
Many people are sensitive about use of the term God. In that sense, in the sense that you're using it, can we equate God with pure consciousness in this case? An all-knowingness, an all-pervasive, pure, universal consciousness? Which many people would say is their God, whatever name they may call their God by.
Yes. No, that's really true. I bring up the term God because from what I've learned is that there's two types of individuals on the spiritual path. There are those who very easily can relate to this idea of an unbounded consciousness, and they can sit and meditate or pursue their spiritual path with a conviction, a firm conviction that there is this unboundedness, it's consciousness alone, and therefore all I need to do is to experience that consciousness in its fullness. Now, there are other people who find that very difficult and very abstract. And for those people, the concept of God or something to devote their attention to put their attention on. And you've been to India, you go to any temple in India, there's a million temples and there's deities and all of these things. It's for those who need a focus, because their ability to conceive of just an unbounded ocean of consciousness that we're all swimming in doesn't ground them on a spiritual path. That's what probably one of the third most translated books on the planet, with the Bhagavad Gita, very clearly says that there are four paths: the path of devotion, the path of knowledge, the path of action. So again, if this universal consciousness has manifested itself in all forms, then it has also provided within that the path or the paths most appropriate to come back to realizing itself.
To think in terms of an absolute pure consciousness, that abstract value, I agree with you, it's more difficult for many in order to relate to that, as opposed to having an object of devotion, which may be seen as a god or the god, depending on which religion.
Whatever you put your attention on, whatever is most important in your life is your God, because you're just totally focused on that. And I remember Swami Lakshmanjoo said to one person who said, I'm not really, don't feel I'm really progressing on the spiritual path. I've been meditating for many years. And he said, when your passion to find yourself, to experience consciousness, is as great as the passion that you had when you first fell in love, he said, then you will begin, because your whole focus, everybody remembers the first time you fell in love, it was your whole world. Now that person, the girl or the boy, wasn't your God, but they may as well have been, because your whole attention, your whole life, your every breath was directed in that direction. And I think this concept comes up for many on whatever spiritual path they're on. A time comes when some experience comes where they feel that same pull and passion and devotion for finding the truth about themselves, which is the truth about yourself is consciousness as manifested through us. Like Thich Nhat Hanh said, that we are consciousness having a human experience.
And when you felt that pull towards Shaivism and the study of it, was it an inexplicable urge, or was there something specific that drew you to it, something on the tangible level?
It was both. It was both, definitely. Maharishi had started a Vedic science course. That was started in 1972 or 73. I didn't have any money to go on that course, but I I got all the copies of all of the books with Maharishi's permission. He said, this is all the stuff that you should study. Do it in your own time. One of those was the Shiva Sutras by Swami Lakshmanjoo. And I read that over and over. That was a draw towards this idea of consciousness, because the very first verse in that is Chaitanyam Atma. Consciousness is everything. And that struck me. And that ignorance, the very second verse, is that ignorance is not knowing undifferentiatedness and knowing differentiatedness. There's two aspects to ignorance. If you don't know everything is consciousness, you're ignorant. And if you know everything is not consciousness, you're ignorant. So that struck me. And then I remember the third verse was about how does something that's as unbounded as an ocean of consciousness become limited? How do you squeeze an ocean into a drop? Where are all the drops? Because we're living in our little bubble. How does that happen? And it happens, it says, through a process of consciousness placing limitation on itself. And that limitation is a false limitation that will make you feel slightly incomplete, slightly less unbounded. So once that happens, once we get squeezed into not a drop, but we're squeezed into Lake Michigan, it's a big drop, then we start to look for completion in the world. We start to move out of consciousness, but not back towards the ocean from where we came, but we start to look for things in the world to fill the void, to fill the gap. And this is considered to be the play of how consciousness plays within itself and draws itself down into the world, so much down into the world to become a rock. And then consciousness, through living beings, through conscious beings, move themselves back towards that ocean. When the urge comes within one, oh, okay, I've done enough. I've done all these things, but they haven't filled the void. They haven't filled me up. I'm wealthy. I've got everything that I ever needed in this world, but there's still something missing. So that's considered to be this descent of consciousness and the rise of consciousness. And anybody can experience that at any level. And that's why it's called a play of consciousness.
Is there any manner by which you could encapsulate or describe how your personal growth has matured over these years, or how your experiences have developed?
I would say that the first thing that happened was when I was taught Kashmir Shaivism, this very subtle barrier, self-imposed really, between formal meditation and action started to disappear. Anybody who practices, say, any type of practice, transcendental meditation, or any type of practice that involves the process of what's called transcending, where you're transcending the limitations of your mind and going to deeper states of consciousness, they'll always feel that after meditation, after they come out, there's some spilling over into the world of that silence, that quietness. It's a natural phenomenon. I'm sure everybody feels that. You can feel it even after prayer. You pray and you come out of that, or you come out of church, wherever, and you feel that you bring some silence with you. But there's always a tendency to create a mental differentiation between, okay, that's practice, or that's going to church, and this is my daily life. And that subtle barrier, that subtle curtain began to fall away for me, and I found that integrating practice into action, it sort of started to spill over. So there wasn't this feeling that if I hadn't meditated, that there was something missing. I would always be very regular with my meditation. It was a joy to sit and meditate and to sink into a very quiet state and feel your breath settle right down. And that's all research. Everybody knows that meditation is good for all aspects of the body. The idea that that is the only way and that outside of meditation, I'm just running around in the world, that started to fall away. I would bring the silence out into my meditation, but it seemed to last longer and longer. So what I was feeling was that barrier between formal meditation and my daily activity started to fall away. And Kashmir Shaivism, which I've followed for the last 40 years, integrates this idea of just being aware during activity, and that's called yoga in action, we can say.
And the action you've been working on for several decades now, actually transcribing word for word the lectures of Swami Lakshmanjoo. You must have gained a great deal, imbibed a lot of his knowledge by going through word for word and transcribing all that wonderful knowledge.
Absolutely. And I can just backtrack a little bit. I was very thirsty for knowledge when I came to Kashmir, but Swamiji threw me headlong into working, and I didn't get any chance to study for about 8 years. It was kind of, you could say it was kind of a Milarepa thing where, go and build this, do this, deconstruct this.
I immediately thought of Milarepa when you said that as well.
Well, my first job was to demolish an old mud cowshed. Swamiji was a very, very great gardener. He had bees, he had his own cows. Everything was self-sufficient, a garden that was immaculate. So he said, could you, since you have civil engineering experience, and are you hands-on? I said, yeah, I'm definitely hands-on. And he said, well, could you demolish this old cowshed? I want to build a Havanchala. That was job number one. Job number two was that when he saw that I did have skills, he wanted to completely demolish his lecture hall, which was an old mud hall, and build a 2-story lecture hall, which today is just used, It wasn't until about 8 years later that John Hughes asked Swamiji George has this background in Sanskrit. It would be wonderful if he could help me with transcribing all of these 700, 800 hours of lectures. And Swamiji just said, just casually said, yes, he should do that. And that was the start. And once I started, I got such inspiration from him when he said, make sure that everything that I've said is correct. Now, I didn't do any Sanskrit translation. This is one thing that's really important to understand. I could read Sanskrit fluently, but I would never consider myself to be a Sanskritist. And what Swamiji did was he didn't lecture just ad lib. He took the most important texts of his tradition, which date back more than 5,000 years, and he translated them verse by verse. And he did it in a way where he didn't give a clearly literal translation. He gave the essence of what each of those verses meant. And that's what I got to dive into for 20 years. And I finished that in 2008, I think. Up to that point, John Hughes had been editing these lectures and publishing books. And after listening to this and imbibing it, I said, John, why don't we just give people the opportunity to hear the original lecture in the voice of a teacher who imbibed the tradition? So from then on, we started producing transcripts along with audios. So that was what I did, yeah.
To be in the presence of a realized individual, an enlightened individual, one who has achieved moksha, liberation, enlightenment, whatever people would like to call it, it's considered a great blessing, and for good reason. And it's given a special name, darshan, because it's known, of course, that one who is enlightened and perceives the reality and the unity of life enlivens that throughout his or her environment. And you enjoyed that darshan of Lakshmanjoo for many years. Can you tell us a little bit about what it was like to be in the presence of Swami Lakshmanjoo Maharaj?
Yeah, it was It was very interesting because from my first meeting with him, I felt a very strong presence. And once I started to work in the ashram and meet him on a daily basis, I saw that he was completely at home with everything that was happening around him. And in Kashmir, saints of his caliber remain very hidden. Hardly anybody knew about him until Maharishi came and visited in 66. So Swamiji had this kind of camouflage where he would behave in such an ordinary way that you would not think that he was an enlightened yogi. And then the very next instant, he would do something so miraculous in such a casual way, you were astounded. And then he had a way of just dropping the curtain over your awareness to where you went back to seeing him as just the person that you were working for. That happened to me on many, many occasions. And I witnessed him using Sidhis. They say that when a yogi reaches a certain level of enlightenment, they develop what's called the Ashta Siddhis. Siddhi means a perfection. So they have these great powers of being able to be small or big, transport themselves in time. You can look up Siddhi on Wikipedia and you can get a very good understanding of what these powers are. But there's another level when a saint or a yogi forgoes these limited powers and they actually get what's called universal siddhis, where then they have control over nature and they only use those for the benefit of people around them. They never use it for their own benefit or their own aggrandizement. And that's what I witnessed around Swami Lakshmanjoo. Although he was a Hindu, he lived in a village which was predominantly Muslim, and many of the Muslim people were his closest devotees.
What a precious and valuable and fortunate experience you've had. Truly, truly blessed. Now, what do you think, just in closing, what do you think the future holds for the world now in terms of spirituality? We see a lot of difficult situations around the world. And we see various conflicts in the world. We see various catastrophes. We see climate change. We see the destruction of the planet. What do you think in terms of the future of the world and the spiritual values of the world? And can spiritual values, in effect, bring the world back from the brink that it's at now?
If one takes a view of a monistic tradition, it's very difficult these days to see that, okay, if there's only one being, why is this one being doing all of this to himself or herself? The world is obviously in turmoil. There's a wonderful verse which says that sometimes the world gets shaken up in order to wake up. And that's a process that has taken place over many, many centuries. We're in a place where, everything looks like we could be entering into World War III, for instance. There's so much turmoil in each country. It's not something that's limited to any one country now. This is global. And yet, for those people that are deeply entrenched in a spiritual path, there's still a sense of peace. It doesn't mean that they don't do anything about this. They do whatever they can within their own capacity, but there's still a sense of peace that this is going on, yes. And I think Maharishi said an interesting thing, that the world can go up and down, but the righteous will survive. Swami Lakshmanjoo has said the same thing. Before leaving this world, he's predicted that there would be a lot of turmoil and upheaval going on in our lifetime. But he said that if you stick securely to your spiritual practice, whatever that is, then you'll feel this protection. You'll feel this inner peace amid the turmoil. And remember, it's not just now. If we go back to what's called the last yuga, and this I mentioned before, the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna and Arjuna in the middle of a battlefield, that was also going to be a fairly tumultuous time. And it all happened, and Krishna's advice to Arjuna was to meditate and to go beyond the phenomena of what's happening. This is the only way that I see it, but I do see that when more and more people are meditating and experiencing a rise of consciousness internally, then the world also gets shaken up. So I think it's definitely something that's happening a balanced scale, and we should always feel positive that there is a light at the end of the tunnel.
Speaking on that hopeful note, we know that, as you said, if the universe is monistic, and if consciousness is primary, and if we can enliven consciousness and bring more of the full value into the surface value of life, then there is a hope to rebalance and create harmony, because consciousness itself knows harmony and balance. And it's only when individuals act out of their great freedom that they can create that imbalance and disharmony.
I would finish with one thing, that there's a very clear understanding in Kashmir Shaivism that each of us has our boundary, our general boundary extends for about 80-mile radius around us in all directions. So we live in a bubble which we create ripples with everything that we do, and those ripples go out for a distance of about 80-mile radius. So that's a big bubble for each of us. And all of our bubbles are overlapped. And we feel the tension of other people's stress and everything. So the more that a person meditates, starts to experience their own consciousness, they create ripples within their own bubble that affects everybody else that's overlapping with them. And, Maharishi called it the 1% effect, but it's true. Peripheral vision for a human being is supposed to be 75 miles. But what we don't realize is that the essence of ourselves is continually vibrating out to that distance. So there's hope. There's hope when we think that people who meditate together in groups and everything, that they're creating this uplifting vibration, which is often upsetting the dross. It's upsetting any corruption or dirt or untruth. And I think that's what's happening. There's a lot of stuff coming to the surface. But I think that ahead there will be a time where consciousness rules supreme again, and everybody moves towards a much more enlightened, not only individual enlightenment, but environmental enlightenment.
Well, it's very much happening now. 20 years ago, 25 years ago, yoga was an oddity. It was made fun of. Now there's a yoga center on every street corner. They're ubiquitous now, and everyone's practicing yoga. Everyone understands the value of taking care of themselves, of developing both mental and physical health, and doing it in a holistic way. Not through pharmaceuticals, not necessarily through calisthenics, but taking recourse to the traditional knowledge that we have from India and other countries. In closing, is there anything you would like to say to our listeners? Any message or any suggestions or hopes or experiences that you'd like to share?
What Swami Lakshmanjoo always said is that anybody who's taken one step on a spiritual path, one step towards understanding themselves, it happens because a grace expands within them and something opens up in their life to want to do that. And he says that grace, as small or feeble as it may be in the beginning, that one step towards a greater realization of oneself is the beginning of a journey that grace will continue to unfold, and that grace is your own grace.
Beautiful, beautiful ending. Thank you so much, George. It's been a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you so much for coming on Simplest State, for sharing your experiences, both as a practitioner of Transcendental Meditation and a teacher and a devotee and great aid to Swami Lakshmanjoo Maharaj. I'm sure that you're serving his ashram and his legacy in the highest order.
And it's also always nice to talk to you as an old friend.